This is CUTV. I'm Marilyn Castleman, and we are here at Concordia University waiting for Andrea Smith's presentation. Andrea Smith is a Cherokee feminist, academic, and author, and she works around the issues of anti-violence, particularly that concerning Native American women. In 2005, Andrea Smith was nominated for a Nobel Peace Prize. So stay tuned. Coming up, Andrea Smith.
Thank you very much. Thank you to the Center for organizing this event. Also to the families of the missing and murdered women of Indigenous women here in Canada that are the reason for why we are here today, as well as to the Indigenous peoples of this land. So I'm speaking primarily from the U.S. context, but I think it's very similar to what's going on in Canada, and that we have epidemic rates of violence against Indigenous women. For instance, in the U.S., Native women are 60% more likely to be victimized by violence than any other women from any other ethnic group. And at the same time, this violence largely happens with impunity, as we can see by the completely inadequate government response to the missing and murdered women in Canada. And also in U.S., because of the jurisdictional maze we see that happens in Indian country, a perpetrator of violence against a Native woman on a reservation can be pretty much assured that nothing will happen to them. Communities. I've been working on these issues of violence for over 20 years, and even within our communities we would see an overwhelming silence where people would say, well, let's worry about colonization first, and then after we deal with that, then we'll worry about women. And the assumption was that colonial violence and gender violence were two separate things. And of course, patriarchy is built on a gender binary system, right? You can't have patriarchy unless you have only two genders, one that dominates another gender. So consequently, in many Native communities that were not built on a gender binary system, those who did not fit that system were often targeted for destruction as well. So sexual violence, the forcing of Native children into Christian boarding schools were all strategies to instill patriarchy into Native communities, so that hierarchy within Native communities would seem natural, and by extension colonial domination would seem more natural. And to give the kind of story of what happened in the U.S., when the anti-violence movement first develops, there's the idea that people concerned about violence can organize to end violence themselves. You know, if there's a perpetrator, maybe we can go to their workplace and harass them. If you need shelter, maybe you can stay in my basement, etc. But pretty soon the state, being the sneaky thing that it is, comes in, and says, little ladies, it looks like you all have a problem with violence, and we'd like to help you solve that problem with a government grant. Of course, when you accept this grant, you will accept all the stipulations that go with this grant. We are not going to be funding any unseemly rabble-rousing activity. No. The problem is that victims are sick, and they need healing from somebody with a PhD or an MSW. You can't heal yourselves. You need an expert to do it for you. And if you want to do any activist work, we want your activism to be involved with the criminal justice system, calling for more police involvement, longer prison sentences, etc., because we are currently building up the prison industrial complex, and we would like to co-opt your feminist rhetoric to support our repressive anti-crime agenda. And this is not something that's known by just kind of the leftist lunatic fringe. This is something known across the political spectrum. People from the right to the left, people who have done studies across political persuasions, all find again and again that more prisons do not lead to less crime. And in fact, John DeLulio, who was at first the primary advocate for the buildup of the prison industrial complex in the U.S., actually came out and said he was wrong, and is now calling for the dismantling of the prison industrial complex, right? So this is an idea that's widely known, and in my research on the Christian right, which is another story, I was actually at an anti-prison strategy session that was filled with Republicans, and they even said they know prisons don't work, but they vote for them because they're popular. In the first place, as Luana Ross notes, the problem with always trying to make things a crime is that we don't consider the fact that genocide has never been a crime in the U.S., right? And in fact, the U.S. is built on the genocide of indigenous peoples. And to quote Sandy Grant, she states, quote, The United States, and we could say Canada too, is a nation defined by its original sin, the genocide of American Indians. American Indian tribes are viewed as an inherent threat to the nation, poised to expose the great lies of U.S. democracy, that we are a nation of laws and not random power, that we are guided by reason and not faith, that we are governed by representation and not executive order, and that we stand as a self-determined citizenry and not a kingdom of blood or aristocracy. From the perspective of American Indians, democracy has been wielded with impunity as the first and most virulent weapon of mass destruction. So consequently, around the world are saying we need to distinguish nations from nation states. That is, when we look for sovereignty and self-determination for a nation, we should not presume that the goal is to come up with a nation state that would be built on these logics of domination and violence. And in fact, we can instead articulate different forms of nationhood that are instead based on mutual respect and responsibility, egalitarian in terms of being the relationship of power between not just peoples but all of creation, and also having a more expansive understanding of nationhood that's not about we're in, you're out, screw the rest of the world, but it's about understanding ourselves and being in radical relationality with all of the world. And what you don't get to say in that system is, well, why should this be anybody's land? Why should land be a commodity that can be bought and sold in the first place, right? This is not the question that we even get to put on the table. And I think this is a problem that Glenn Coulthard, who's a Dene scholar and activist, has noted. The trap of the legal system is that it often changes the way we even see our struggles for self-determination. And that we often say we are fighting for sovereignty or self-determination, but actually what we're fighting for is recognition. So to illustrate this problem, we will turn to our handy diagram that you can't see, but we will visualize it for you. So we will give you a grant, we will give you money, we will give you something that you ask for. But you have to prove how cool, interesting, and spiritual you are, or else we might give it to some other group. So each group that needs to fight with each other to prove who's the most cool, interesting, and spiritual, who's most quadruply oppressed, who most deserves to get this recognition, right? So consequently, you don't get to work with each other anymore because we're too busy competing to get this overall recognition. So we say we're doing this in the interest of self-determination, but actually we'll never get self-determination under this system because we're presuming the settler state will always be the group to recognize us, right? So our goal stops being a struggle where we recognize each other and develop the mass movements needed to actually topple this system. Rather, we presume the continuation of the system and simply try to get a piece of recognition within this system. And I think this is a problem why we often see in our struggles for self-determination an inability to address issues of gender violence or other inequities within our struggles for self-determination, because we're not actually fighting for liberation, we're fighting for recognition, we're fighting for white justice and white liberty. We're fighting to be on the top of the system rather than to change the system altogether, to make up for the work that millions of people need to be doing. And this is what I learned at the World Social Forum. Folks from Chile were saying, we laugh. So now I will just turn to what are some ways that people are trying to kind of operationalize these politics. And by putting forth a few examples, I don't mean these as prescriptions, because I think one thing we need to challenge as we challenge kind of this pyramid system is how it gets internalized within our movements for self-determination. And one way it gets internalized is that we tend to assume there's some expert or some leader who's going to save us, right? So we end up having these hierarchies within our movements. It's either the middle managers of the nonprofit industrial complex, or it's the revolutionary vanguard elite, somebody else who knows the best way to liberate us. But if anybody actually knew how to end global oppression, we would have done it by now. So let's just admit we don't really know what we're doing, and instead adopt a more humble air of trial and error, a humble approach of trial and error. In doing so, we'd be more likely to share what doesn't go wrong, so we don't keep doing the same thing that doesn't go wrong, but also we could adopt a more flexible approach, recognizing that the way the system works changes all the time, so something that works now isn't going to keep working. We always must be adopting our strategies appropriately. Right? So if we ask ourselves the question, what can I do? There's often not much you can do other than call the police or do nothing. But if you ask yourselves the question, what can we do? You will often be surprised at the creative ideas that can emerge from that conversation. And they said it sounded like a good idea at the time, but there became a number of problems. First of all, these movements are so hierarchical that people were replicating the same hierarchies that they thought they were getting rid of. Two, these movements were not very inclusive because not many people can actually get guns, go to the mountains, and take over the state. So they were controlled by a few group of people. But also, as folks from Chiapas said, well, we thought, we could get our guns and take over the state, and then we realized the state had a lot more guns than we did. So the alternative idea came about, which was to say, well, what if we just started living differently? What if we divested from the current system? What if we started to create our own autonomous communities, did our own healthcare, our own educational systems? What if we developed alternative governance structures that were based on different principles of mutuality, respect, and equality? And most importantly, what if we started to proliferate these zones? So it would not be enough to have a cool, hippie, groovy commune zone that we often have, in the U.S. context. But instead, once a zone gets established, people have to go start another zone until they grow, and grow. Well, if everybody started living differently, then it would be limited as to what the money and guns could do. Okay. So you will note that particularly professors and students will often say, I can't join the revolution because I'm too sick, tired, busy, and depressed. But unfortunately, if we're going to organize our movement around everybody who's not sick, tired, busy, and depressed, we have two people to end global oppression. But I think what they're speaking to is there's an unsustainable way we do our organizing. And we often do it through kind of a nonprofit industrial complex model where there's the assumption that you will get paid to do the organizing work. So we have kind of this career activist model in which a few people are supposed to work 1 million hours a week to make up for the work that millions of people need to be doing. And this is what I learned at the World Social Forum. Folks from Chile were saying, we laugh at you in the US. You get very excited when you get 200 people to a protest, and then you go get a police permit to march against police brutality. What good does that do, they said. And also, when we have a vision of where we want to go, it helps us measure our short-term strategies so that we know if we're getting closer to where we want to go or farther away from that. So to give you one example, I was at a domestic violence conference, and at this workshop, we were asked to brainstorm on what we would like to see in 20 years. And everybody said things like more hotlines and more shelters, and nobody said less violence. Like we actually forgot why we were there, which is why we probably adopted so many dumb strategies, because we forgot to ascertain if they were effective or not, right? And then finally, even though I think one of the effects of the settler colonialism is not just how it directly oppresses us, but also how it shapes our imagination. It changes what we even think is possible, right? So when we say, what if we had a world without the US or without Canada, that sounds ridiculous. But the fact that it sounds ridiculous when both of these countries are based on the continuing genocide of indigenous peoples goes to show the extent to which the settler colonialism has shaped our imaginations, that we can't imagine a more just world outside these systems.
We've just been listening to Andrea Smith talking about the many issues that she deals with: anti-violence, feminism, Native American land issues, and there was a great crowd in there. She talked for about an hour, and what you have just seen are a few excerpts from her talk. A very engaging speaker, and everyone really enjoyed listening to her. Hot topics, not that easy to live with, but however, it was a very, very interesting evening. So thank you for being with us at CUTV. I'm Marilyn Castleman. See you later.